Hello, everyone. We hope that you're doing well today. My name is Nadia Mohajer, and I'm founder and executive director of HEART, a national nonprofit that is working to promote sexual health literacy and sexual violence prevention in Muslim communities. I live on the south side of Chicago, and I'm also a mom of three. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Dr. Juliana Hammer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Hammer. I'm a professor of Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and my research and teaching interests focus on gender and sexuality in American Muslim communities, which is why I'm here today. I am also a member of the Scholarly Advisory Board of HEART.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammer. We are so thrilled to present to you today our contribution to the programming for the Religion and Repro Learning Center at the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
So the purpose of this video is to provide you with a better understanding of what it means to be at the intersection of Muslim communities and reproductive justice. As Muslim women working in the reproductive and gender justice space, both academic and advocacy related, we often get asked, what does Islam say about X, for example, abortion or birth control? And the answer to the question, first and foremost, is that Islam doesn't say anything because Islam isn't a person. And more importantly, like everything else, it's complicated. So before we can get to any kinds of answers, it seemed important to us for you to understand the landscape of the issues that Muslims are facing in the United States when it comes to reproductive justice.
So what will you get out of this talk? So from this talk, we're hoping that you're going to get a deeper understanding of who Muslims are, some core Islamic values that are important to them, and an understanding of the diversity of approaches to talking about sex and sexuality in Islam. We're also hoping to provide you some background on HEART, which is a national nonprofit that is working at the intersection of being a Muslim and reproductive justice, and really giving you some sort of insight on what the challenges and roadblocks are to this work. And finally, we want to close out with providing you with some understanding of what the resources and opportunities are available to us as we do this work as well. As Juliana mentioned, what you will not get in this talk is what Islam says about any number of topics, including abortion, contraception, or any of those issues. You will also not get a formula or a script on how to talk to Muslims about these issues, or even a comprehensive understanding of all Muslims, because we cannot represent all Muslims. And Juliana is going to talk a little bit about how diverse our communities are and why we feel so strongly about not being able to represent all Muslims.
So I want to talk a little bit about Muslims in the United States in particular, also pointing out that that's a relatively small portion of Muslims throughout the world. If there are, as we believe right now, about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world and probably around 7 million in the United States, we want to, at every point here, be careful to not generalize and assume a unified identity. So just for Muslims in the United States, if you look at the pie chart here, you might see some things that you might be surprised about. For example, that about 30% of Muslims in the US are African American. And so at the very least, on the level of racial and ethnic diversity, we have to account for a really broad spectrum of difference. But that's not the only way in which US Muslims are not homogenous. We also have a wide spectrum of education, of geographically distributed communities across the United States. Muslims run across the socioeconomic spectrum of the United States. We have gender and sexual orientation and ability, and one additional sort of issue of, not issue, but point of diversity that's really important to mention here is that Muslims have embrace a wide variety of religious interpretations and practices. So that means that there's both an opportunity, that this is both an opportunity. Diversity is not a problem. We want to point out that we don't consider diversity of Muslims in all these different ways a challenge or a problem. It's an opportunity, but it also means that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work. Additional sort of points, again, related to diversity, but also to how Islam comes into this. So Islam has been represented by scholars and has been discussed by scholars as a sex-positive religion. Like everything, that also is more complicated, but it does, as a religious tradition, promote mutual pleasure between partners. There is an expectation that sex takes place within the boundaries of marriage, which also means abstinence until marriage, which is expected of all genders, not just of girls and women. Islamic law, often represented in the media as sort of the boogeyman of why Muslims are especially different, is actually a 1400-year-old and very dynamic system that has evolved over time since the beginnings of Islam in the 7th century, but that is also continuously responding to cultural, social, historical, and political developments and contexts. And so it changes with Muslims and it changes Muslims in turn, but is not something where if we don't want to say Islam says, we can also not say Islamic law says. So it is more complicated than that. And especially in the US context, in specific ways, it's also important to recognize that the ways in which Muslims today talk about sex and sexuality is not only influenced by their own perception of Islam as a historical tradition, but also by the impact of colonialism and Christian supremacy. So the colonial experience for Muslims in the 19th century, which affected basically all Muslims throughout the sort of geographical region where Muslims are a majority, has changed attitudes to sex and sexuality. And in the US context, Christian notions of sex and sexuality permeate societal attitudes, and that affects Muslims in turn as well.
So what is heart? We, as I mentioned, sit at the intersection of being Muslim and reproductive justice and anti-sexual violence advocacy. So we are a national organization founded in the year of 2010. We have a national team of 5 staff and 15 additional trainers across the country. And our mission is to work to ensure that all Muslims have the resources, language, and choice to nurture sexual health and confront sexual violence. And ultimately, we're working toward a vision where all people are free, including Muslims, are free from sexual violence and can thrive in the communities that they live, work, and pray in. A lot of our work is informed by my own personal training and a lot of my staff's training in the fields of public health and mental health and reproductive justice work, where we are really using an interdisciplinary approach as well as an ecological approach to creating this cultural shift in the communities that we're working in. So recognizing that, in order to create behavior change or reduce certain health disparities or outcomes, you not only have to increase health education efforts and addressing health access to health information at the individual level, you also have to work to dismantle a lot of the structural and institutional and societal barriers to these services and information. So for example, it's not just about saying, oh, we have a bunch of pamphlets at the mosque, and now all of a sudden Muslims will have access to the information that they need. It's also being creative and thinking about, well, are those pamphlets being read, and are there other barriers, whether it's cultural barriers or institutional barriers, that are actually preventing the community from actually safely accessing that, and more importantly, processing that information and internalizing it to create that behavior change. So really, Heart was founded out of this need to sort of recognize that a lot of Muslims, regardless of the diversity of their lived experience and their racial identities and cultural um, and religious practice, a lot of the people that we were working with were kind of sharing with us that they did not feel that they had access to culturally informed services and information in a way that they could access, that made them feel safe, that made them feel valued, and that took into consideration their religious and cultural context as they were making decisions about their bodies. And so that's really why we were founded. We were founded to empower individuals to become these agents of change in their own communities. And our curriculum does not just offer sexual health and sexual violence information, but it also guides participants to really explore their own personal and cultural biases, challenges them to assess their own privileges, and teaches them strategies to dismantle systems of oppression and make sexual health and sexual violence information and services really more accessible to all in our communities. So how do we essentially do this? We do this through our 4 programming arms. We love acronyms at Heart. You're going to notice that in some of the things that we are going to be talking about. Our 4 programming arms are health education, advocacy, research, and training. And as I mentioned, each of these programs kind of reach a different level of society. So our health education program is exactly what you would imagine. It's in-person and virtual programming, information, toolkits, publications, videos that we produce in order for individuals and communities to be able to feel like they have access to information that takes into account their religious and cultural context, and be able to make more informed decisions about their bodies, sex, and sexual violence. Advocacy is both at the individual and the systems level. The individual level, we're working one-on-one with people who reach out for additional information or referrals for services. So for example, a survivor might reach out to us and say, I was assaulted last night, and I would like help filing a police report. Or I would like help telling my family, disclosing to my family. So these are the kinds of advocacy that we might provide them. We've also had individuals reach out to us and ask us, where can I find an IUD that is free? And so making those referrals as well to the specific clinics in their local areas that will offer that kind of service for them for free. We also do advocacy at the systems level, where we're starting to dabble in some policy work and really uplift Muslim voices in the conversation around reproductive justice and rights from a sociopolitical context in this country. So last year we produced a voting guide that looked at a few ballot measures that had to do with reproductive justice across the country, and really talked about how our recommendations for how to vote on those ballot measures and what implications they have for Muslim communities. We do research where we partner with local institutions to deepen our understanding of the needs of Muslim communities. And also we partner with Muslim women academics like Juliana Hammer and others, where we sort of bridge the gap between what's happening in activist movements and in academic circles, and sort of bridge the gap and deepen our learnings and bring that scholarship and uplift those gender equitable understandings of the faith to the communities that we're working with. And finally, we work to provide training. And so this, we would say, is kind of at the institutional level, where we're training mainstream professionals, Muslim institutions, to deepen their capacity to be able to serve the Muslims that they serve in a way that is more aligned with the needs of Muslims, as well as aligned with being trauma informed and aligned with public health frameworks of prevention.
So we want to transition into discussing a little bit what the challenges and perhaps barriers are to Muslim reproductive justice work, and somewhat more specifically, the work of Heart and also my work. So very broadly speaking, and anyone connected to RCRC is no stranger to that issue, we know that that there exists a narrative in the advocacy community and in the feminist community, for that matter, that religion and reproductive rights are mutually exclusive, or also that religion and feminism are mutually exclusive, and that at the very least, religion is considered a roadblock to achieving reproductive justice. And while it is true, both for other religions and for Islam, that religious narratives and interpretations have been used to police and control Muslims and reproductive rights, so these are valid narratives that we encounter in our communities regularly. These are not the only narratives. And so we want to talk a little bit later today about how religion, in particular Islam, can also be a resource for this work, so and can be a tool of empowerment. Before we get to that, I want to say a little bit more about what we consider particular roadblocks that have to do with religion in complicated ways. The first one is the issue of anti-Muslim hostility, to most of you probably more familiarly connected to the term Islamophobia. I do not use the term Islamophobia as a scholar, or I try to stay away from it, because it reduces a complex and systemic issue of racism, marginalization, and exclusion of Muslims to an individualized pathology. And most of the time, I would argue what people are expressing, what people and institutions and systems are expressing, is not fear of Muslims, but rejection of Islam, so racist attitudes, and sometimes in the US context, also the denying of Muslims the status as a religious community. So the term anti-Muslim hostility, I think, captures better what is at stake in how these phenomena are connected with each other. And as long as we don't level a systemic critique, we can also not change things at the systemic level. So anti-Muslim hostility is prevalent in the United States. Most Muslims in polls, for example, report various instances from relatively innocent sounding microaggressions to hate crimes and hate crime murders. And even if that happens, if some of these happen to relatively small numbers of people, the effect that it has is to create fear. And as I show in much of my research, Muslims adjust to these representations and these experiences in a variety of ways, none of them necessarily positive. So it affects the sense of belonging, the sense of integration in American society, but also the ability of Muslims to be critical of American society. And work around gender and sexuality and around reproductive justice is particularly impacted by anti-Muslim hostility. So to give you a small example, I have also done work on domestic violence. And my experience has been that whenever I want to talk about Muslim efforts against domestic violence, what my audience primarily hears is that there is domestic violence in Muslim communities. And so having to lay out a framework where we are able to and engaged in both a critique of these anti-Muslim attitudes in American society, including in the reproductive justice movement, and of patriarchal attitudes in Muslim communities and harmful practices, to really just emphasize here that these are not mutually exclusive. Both of these go together and are integral parts of the work that we do. The second roadblock to us seems to be an important one, which is that if religious frameworks are engaged around issues of reproductive justice, they tend to be Christian-centric, in the sense that even calling them religious frameworks and only meaning Christian frameworks happens all the time. My students use the word religion to only describe Christianity, and when I ask them about it, are really surprised that there's anything else to consider. And in the field of reproductive justice, the fact that Christian attitudes historically and contemporarily are equally complicated along the lines of sexual choice, sexual diversity, issues such as same-sex marriage, are often ends up sort of providing a framework that is supposed to fit everyone else, or that produces a kind of straitjacket, right? And other religious communities, including Muslims, are then sort of used as a counterpoint, as a backdrop for a primarily Christian conversation. So that definitely constitutes an additional challenge in the work that we do. And then lastly, I like the term patriarchal interpretations. We're talking about Muslim and Islamic patriarchal interpretations. And those are a challenge, and our work in part consists of finding ways to represent what is often by Muslims, by patriarchal Muslims, I call them patriarchal Muslims, by patriarchal Muslims as Islam, as the only right interpretation. So to be able to push back against that by demonstrating that this is that these come out of a particular historical context and out of particular political contexts as well, and that they are not the only option, that there are other ways, and there have always been other ways to interpret Islamic sacred sources and Islamic law. And so these patriarchal interpretations are by many Muslims considered mainstream and self-evidently Islamic, while we struggle to demonstrate how our interpretations also fit onto a broader diversity spectrum of interpretations.
So now that we've talked a little bit about the challenges that come with doing reproductive justice work in Muslim communities, we also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the resources that makes this work possible, both in activist spaces like Hearts and as well as academic spaces like Juliana's spaces. So really thinking about, we talked a little bit about in the beginning about how Islamic law evolves over time, and there are so many schools of thoughts, 4 Sunni schools and 3 Shia schools at the minimum, and even more additional schools of thought, and really how that offers a range of opinions, Islamic legal opinions on any variety of issues pertaining to gender and sexuality. So, opinions can range from being extremely restrictive, regarding something to do with perhaps family planning or abortion, to also very flexible or permissive, depending on what the situation is and the context is. And so it's really important to really, first and foremost, take into account the breadth and the depth of Islamic law, and how it's really not reduced to a black and white sort of legal opinion on X issue. Now, that being said, a lot of times what we've noticed is that oftentimes when people are talking about gender and sexuality, particularly with issues that have to do with women and other people with uteruses, the conversation often begins and ends at Islamic law. And I want to name that there are a variety of other ways to also approach these issues. And the scope of Islamic knowledge actually goes beyond Islamic law and also includes Islamic ethics frameworks and lived experiences. And, while Islamic law and Islamic ethics do intersect, they're also very distinct sciences. And, it's really important to approach them in a way that is interdependent and they can play off of each other. So it's really, I think, when we're talking about issues about reproductive justice, about gender, about sexuality, alongside Islamic law, we also have to really take into consideration Islamic ethics frameworks and lived experiences. So really, exploring, just because something may be permissible in by the law, what are the ethical implications of that, and should it still be something that is uplifted or promoted? And this goes back to Juliana's point about patriarchal interpretations, where oftentimes those are very valid, and many Muslims do rely on them to inform their daily lives. And that being said, there are also gender equitable interpretations that are just as valid, but perhaps not as dominant. And so really thinking about how do we rely on these different, the diversity of legal opinions, as well as the different ethical frameworks that we have to our disposal, to come up with some really nuanced conversations and approaches to gender and sexuality and reproductive justice. So I did mention that there are various gender equitable interpretations of Islamic tradition, including the work of many North American Muslim women scholars, as well as globally. There are many Muslim women scholars that have done really phenomenal work to uplift a lot of the gender equitable interpretations when it comes to family planning, when it comes to fertility and fertility treatments, and abortion, and just all of those different issues that we sort of debate all the time in our communities. Really trying to uplift this work. We work in collaboration with a lot of these women scholars. Juliana mentioned we have a scholars advisory board, and often, I will be taking them inquiries that I receive about very specific issues that Muslims are navigating, and I will take it to them. And there's just a wealth of knowledge that and gender equitable interpretations that they're able to share with me. Another example, very quickly, is most recently there was a question about donating breast milk in Muslim communities, and that, is that possible? Because Islamic law, there's an Islamic law that says breast milk establishes motherhood and siblings between milk siblings, and so they no longer are able to marry each other. So there's a whole legal sort of situation around that. And oftentimes the conversation around breast milk donation will begin and end at that, and say, well, you can't donate breast milk because the children who drink that milk will become siblings and they can no longer marry each other. And it just begins and ends at that. And so that really limits a lot of women's ability to either receive breast milk donations or give breast milk donation. It also has a lot of implications for adoption practices in Islam. And what I learned from that conversation was that a lot of phenomenal Muslim women scholars have actually done a lot of research on breast milk donation and what establishes motherhood, again relying a lot on Islamic ethics frameworks as well, and really pushing the envelope on, is it breast milk that establishes motherhood, or is it the act of feeding that establishes motherhood? So really taking into account that there is no one right answer to this, and the conversation can become very complex and very nuanced when we're addressing some of these issues.
Can I
Yes,
interject
of
real quick
course.
something that I think would be helpful here to think about a little bit? So I often take it for granted because I've been doing this work for a really long time, but I think it is worth pointing out here that Muslims don't have the same types of hierarchical structures of authority. So there is no equivalent of the church in Muslim community settings, never has been. And so the role of scholars and the relationship of scholars to religious authority, so whose opinion is authoritative if there are 25 different ones or 150 different ones, is actually a sort of active topic of conversation at all time. And so again, here, rather than seeing that as an obstacle to a singular answer, a sort of like, here's the true Islamic answer to this question, I have really fought all my life as a Muslim, thought of that as an incredible opportunity to arrive at accepted practices and accepted interpretations through building consensus. And
Mhm.
so I think it's important to point out here that this notion of gender equitable interpretations, there are many of them, and through HEART and through the Scholarly Advisory Board, but also beyond it, we are in conversation with each other rather than claiming exclusive authority, really thinking about a spectrum of possibilities, and some of HEART's work revolves around building interpretive consensus, so that communities and community members can be assured that this is within the scope of possibilities. But the diffuse nature of Islamic religious authority, I think, needs to be pointed out here as a point of difference, but not as a point of negative difference.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I think, it's only an opportunity for us to have access to this kind of diverse and breadth range of approaches to this work. And, just real briefly addressing some of the barriers to this work, oftentimes, to your point about whose opinion is credible or not, our community is not immune to those kinds of identity politics, and those identity politics happen all the time. You can imagine a cisgender male's credibility will be more credible in a space than perhaps a Muslim woman's or a queer Muslim's, etc. And so those kinds of identity politics often happen, that serve as some roadblocks to those work. And we still see it as an opportunity to continue to just be louder and uplift a lot of those gender equitable interpretations, and sort of quote unquote mainstream them, so that they do become the dominant sort of way of approaching these issues, and not necessarily remain sort of something that you have to dig for. We also heavily rely on the work of other people of color-led orgs like Sister Song. There's also Sister Love, and other reproductive justice orgs that we're learning from with their frameworks, but also contributing to their work by sort of talking about the ways in which their frameworks may not be perfectly fit for Muslims, and really pushing back on some of those frameworks and saying, here's where it doesn't work for us, and here's how we would approach it, or how we would look at it. And then finally, we're gonna move into a little bit talking about HEART's work, and really representing some of the tangible tools that we've developed, and other sort of resources that you all can look into moving forward. So the first tool that I wanted to talk about is again, this goes back to our love for acronyms. We have a framework that we developed called Responding for Rahma. And Rahma is a core Islamic value. It is also the Arabic word for compassion. God is one of his of his 99 attributes, his greatest attribute is Ar-Rahman, which is the most compassionate. And Muslims are encouraged to embody that kind of compassion with other living beings. And so we decided to really reclaim this word when thinking about responding to sensitive disclosures. So initially, we developed this tool specifically because we noticed that people in Muslim communities were really struggling with the right words and having the right approach to responding to Muslims who have experienced sexual violence and their disclosures. But what we ultimately learned is that this tool is actually more universal than that, and actually can be helpful to respond to any sensitive disclosure that may happen, whether it has to do with sexual violence or a reproductive health issue. So it's really drawing upon the reality that how you respond in the moment of disclosure can have a transformative impact on the person's individual capacity to seek healing, to seek additional services, to seek help, to seek justice. And not believing someone for their lived experience or for their sexual violence that they've experienced can deeply impact their trauma and their spiritual health and their ability to feel spiritual guilt around that. So what is the Rahma acronym? It is simply, it's a 5-step framework where somebody will come to you with a sensitive disclosure, and you first and foremost respond by listening. So really just thanking them for trusting you with their story and listening to what they have to hear and reflecting back to them what you've heard from them. Affirming and believing them. So really telling them that, like, you aren't alone. I believe you. There are people who can help. Honoring their cultural and religious context. This is important. We find that this one is important in both Muslim communities when we're training Muslims, and it's also important when we're training mainstream professionals. Oftentimes, again, it's, our own biases can come in the way when we respond. And we might want to save the person, or we might want to correct if they are holding on to a belief or a fear that is informed by patriarchy or classism or anti-Blackness or misogyny. Our gut is to immediately correct them and shame them for having that for having that belief. But oftentimes it's such a deeply ingrained part of their culture or religion that is not part of the religion but part of their social context, that it's really important to not shame them in the moment and honor where they're coming from with their fears, and honoring that context so that they feel like affirmed in that moment, and are able to move forward. Then we maintaining privacy. Now, this, especially if in the context of healthcare providers, this seems really simple. It's part of healthcare providers training to maintain confidentiality. And oftentimes this comes very easy, and it's a no-brainer for folks who are in health services. That being said, when we're training Muslims and other people who are in sort of more first responder situations where they're not necessarily a healthcare worker, but they are maybe a teacher or a mother or just a local, community member, maintaining confidentiality and privacy often is a challenging notion to play around with. And part of that is because Muslim communities are very, very small, and there's 2 degrees of separation. So even if somebody is de-identifying a story, oftentimes people can put together the puzzle pieces and know exactly who you're talking about. And so just being able to let people interact with what it means to maintain confidentiality in a way that protects the person who has disclosed is often a lot of the time that we spend on in our trainings. And then finally, assisting with providing resources. So that's like the action step, right? Like really making sure that people know they're not alone and that there are professionals that can help them. There are professionals that can maintain their confidentiality, and sitting with them and helping them find what they need, whether that is a trauma-informed therapist or a medical provider, or if they do want to pursue legal options, what that looks like, just really sitting with them and making sure that they have the right referrals that they need, before stepping back and letting them continue to pursue justice. So what does this actually look like in reality? So we have a case study here. A young Muslim woman who never attended sex education courses begins dating her next door neighbor and quickly falls into an unhealthy pattern. He does not respect her boundaries regarding sex, and eventually she gets pregnant. She wants to get an abortion as she is getting pressure from her partner. However, her family is against it and is shaming her for considering abortion. So how would you actually respond with Rahma? We have a little script here, but what is going to be even more, I think, crucial to this conversation is after the script, Juliana and I will sort of start looking at how this case study could be different depending on different circumstances. So, really thinking about how would you respond with Rahma. So thank you for listening, trusting me. I understand that you're confused about what your options are. Affirming and believing looks like you are not alone. Many people have experienced what you have. And now the H part, honoring their culture and religious context. I know that your family and cultural background has many traditions around respect for life, and it may seem like getting an abortion against your faith values. You are the best person to make this decision, and I know there are a number of diverse opinions on the permissibility of abortion in Islam. Finally, maintaining privacy. We can find people who can help you that will honor your privacy and your family's privacy. And A, can I help you find someone who can help? Just want to uplift the H here. I see, and again, the next slide will kind of talk about this. Even here, I don't want to sort of simplify it, right? Like, it's not this simple to just say, you are the best person. And, I know there are a number of diverse opinions. I mean, it can get really complicated, but it's also giving them back the control and allowing them to sort of consider their faith values alongside what they want to do for themselves, and not feel like they have to either compartmentalize it or only consider the faith values or only consider what they want for themselves. And this kind of allows space for them to negotiate both. So just really thinking about how this would be different.
So if we sort of think about this particular case study, you probably have experience with using case studies to illustrate a point. But if we connect the case study approach also back to my earlier point about anti-Muslim hostility, this particular example here could very well just sort of confirm quite a few preconceived notions. And so we wanted to point out that the response, especially the H response, the honoring culture and religious context, would make for both a different perception of the case study itself if, for example, the woman was married. So that would connect to what I said earlier about sex within marriage. How is sex outside of marriage viewed? What happens when there isn't only sex outside of marriage, but an actual demonstrable outcome, which is pregnancy? Does it make a difference in how Muslim community members, family members, and both mainstream and Muslim providers would respond to this particular situation if the neighbor and partner of the pregnant woman is Muslim or not? What happens if in the scenario it's not the partner who's pressuring for abortion, but it's the parents because they are wanting to protect the woman's reputation? How does the conversation about abortion change when there are fetal abnormalities? really just to point out that there are many variables to this story, and even all the way to what does it mean to say a young Muslim woman who never attended sex education courses? Are we here reinscribing that Muslims are uniquely opposed to sex education in school? They're not uniquely opposed to it. Some Muslims are and some Muslims aren't. I live in a state, North Carolina, that has a state mandated abstinence only curriculum that I don't even consider sex education. So really to point out that each of the phrases in this case study needs to be considered as a particular iteration that isn't a one size fits all. So, and even if one of you listeners and watchers here would encounter that exact scenario, there isn't a singular answer to how to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to point out, oftentimes another to show a way this case study has changed a little bit, like another like direction that we've seen it take is, the woman is not married, she gets pregnant, and her fear is, perhaps she's engaged. So her fear is that her fiance's family is going to break the engagement. No one's going to want to marry her, etc. And again, like to the point about honoring that context, this is not the moment to say that's patriarchy, or you deserve better, or whatever. This is the moment to honor that experience and say, I hear you, this is really important to you, I understand why this is important to you, I understand that, this is important to your community. Let's talk about how we can get you the help that you need. And then, worrying about correcting that, misinformation or whatever, what have you, later on when the person is not in a trauma situation or a crisis situation. So these case studies, I mean, yes, the Rahma framework provides, a very loose framework on how to respond to some of these situations, while recognizing that any number of the responses can be so different based on what the context of the situation is. So we just want to close with just a few more resources that we've developed, and we encourage you to look at more further. The first one is on our website, www.hearttogrow.org. We have a resource library where you can see on the left, you can even sort of filter by the type of resource or the category of the issue that you're looking for. And once you filter by that, you'll find all of the resources that have to do in that category. So you'll see fact sheets, you'll see videos, toolkits, research papers that you will be able to interact with and have access to and learn from, that have to do with reproductive health, pelvic health, sexual violence, abortion, etc. We currently have a video series on fertility and sexual health decision making that we are releasing every couple of weeks. That is a video series, and so just there's a lot of variety of resources that we have on our website to also enable folks to interact with us in a way that is more anonymous, if that is the way that they feel comfortable accessing this information. We also have education on Facebook and Instagram, where we do a number of infographic type, I guess, stories or education about, simple topics. So for example, the one that's posted here is about tampons and how oftentimes the conversation about tampons in Muslim communities is also that tampons are not permissible. So haram, it means forbidden, are not permissible because, perhaps it compromises your virginity, etc. And so we have some education around tampons and how, you know, that's actually misinformed, again, by, you know, gender stereotypes, by ideas of patriarchy, by ideas of sexuality, and also sexual purity, right? Like ideas of sexual purity that are informed by colonial ideas and things like that. So just really trying to debunk some of this misinformation and myths through, you know, sometimes humorous, sometimes serious infographics that very simply and accessibly kind of name all of these things.
Can I just interject here real quick to say that both that the resource library on the Heart website is like Islamic law, in like a dynamic resource, in the sense that it gets expanded and developed further. One of the things that I've been really impressed with in the work that I've seen Heart do is this continuous development of resources, the responding to experiences of using these resources for trainings, for example, and then adjusting them, adjusting something like this infographic. You can see that it says second edition to some of the discussions that happened around it. And I am always really excited to see when new infographic post type things are up on Facebook and Instagram, and they generate discussion, but they're also really informative in a way that sort of gets to the heart of some of the issues that are among the issues that some Muslims at least are uncomfortable talking about. And there, you may have gotten sort of the sense that we started out with it's complicated and we refuse to give you certain types of answers. That doesn't mean that there aren't any answers or any signposts or any orientation points. And these infographics in particular have been, for me, really useful. I use some of them as teaching tools in my undergraduate classes, even because they don't leave you with total relativism, with we don't know anything about anything and that's why it's complicated, but actually say things like very clearly tampons are not haram, they're not forbidden. That is a misconception. And here is why that misconception probably exists. And then to debunk why that misconception about tampons exists in the first place by offering often scientific information, and offering really just sort of basic knowledge that to me is also part of sex education, right? That this sort of like a tiny piece of sex education. And then to think of sex education and education of sexual health as a precondition for reproductive justice. So knowing better means knowing better what choices and opportunities people have. And so I have, over the last few years, become a huge fan of these. And as I said, every time a new one gets posted, I'm like, what is this one about? Let's see what they did with this one. And I love the clarity. So as infographics go, they're really useful, and often open the door for more conversation rather than closing it to say, this is the truth and now there's nothing else to talk about.
Thank you so much. Just two more things that we're going to share is the Women's Mosque of America is in Southern California. And you know, because of COVID and the pandemic, they've gone to having services virtually. And so most recently, our colleague at Heart, Sahar Pirzada, did a very nuanced and compassionate discussion on leaning on Islam to navigate pregnancy loss and abortion, drawing upon our own lived experience of pregnancy loss and termination. And so we've listed the YouTube there if you would like to see that. You know, we will be able to, we plan on continuing the conversation, particularly about abortion and pregnancy loss, and develop future resources. And I guess this is a repeat slide because I believe I already talked about the resource library. So I will go to the end. Here is all of the ways that you can contact us. Thank you so much for your time and for having us being able to contribute our work to this project. We are very grateful, and we hope that you follow us on social media and follow our website and contact us if you have any questions or concerns. And I turn it over to Dr. Hammer to close us out.
Well, thank you everyone for listening and watching. Thank you, Nadia, for working on this with me. This has been a really, really exciting collaboration for me, because one of the things that I'm really invested in as a scholar is doing work across this imagined boundary between scholarship and advocacy work. And I'm hoping that it is useful. And I always have to say this, I'm originally from Germany, and I have found that Americans often sort of issue invitations to follow up and then don't really mean it. When I put my email address somewhere, I actually mean it. I am interested in further conversation, and so are the great people at Heart. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. And please do contact us.